Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Florida Instructional Designer Network Professional Development Webinar Series. Thank you for joining us today. I am Tom Tu from Florida Virtual Campus. I am your host for the webinar. The FL-IDN is brought to you through the partnership with the State University System of Florida Board of Governors, the Florida College System, independent colleges and universities of Florida, and the Florida Virtual Campus. If you haven't done so, please subscribe to the IDN listserv for news, announcements, professional development opportunities, as well as effective practices and rich resources shared by our wonderful community members. The subscription is free for everyone. As instructional designers strive to respond to the ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on teaching and learning, conditions for learning also continue to evolve. How can ID processes support instructional continuity needs in ways that result in engaging and effective learning experiences? Today, we are honored to have Dr. Barbara Lockee, Provost Faculty Fellow and Professor of Instructional Design and Technology at Virginia Tech, as our guest speaker. For more than 2 decades, Dr. Lockee's research and teaching activities have focused on the intersection of instructional design, distance education, and professional development. Dr. Lockee is past president of the Association for Educational Communications and Technology, AECT, an international professional organization for instructional technology researchers and practitioners. Dr. Lockee will explore strategies and considerations for the design of flexible learning solutions with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lockee to the podium. Thank you very much, Dr. Lockee. It's yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Tom. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. I see a lot of names that I know, and it's great to see so many of you here today and a lot of new acquaintances. And thank you all for joining today as well. As Tom said, I'm Barbara Lockee. It's an honor to be with you here today. Also joining me will be my cat, Carlos. Apparently, he's interested in participating. So it's always interesting working from home, right? So anyway, I'm coming to you live synchronously from Blacksburg, Virginia, and it's an honor to be with you today. I was saying earlier that before we got started that this is one of my favorite topics. And it has been for some time with regard to how to design flexible learning opportunities for learners in all kinds of environments. But as you all have experienced in the past year and a half or so, flexible learning has become not just an area of interest, but mandatory. So with that, what I'd like to do is get started with the presentation, and I'll go through some key ideas about considerations for flexible learning, strategies for designing flexible learning, and then I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, so it's not just me talking at you. So anyway, I'll go ahead and get started and share my screen here. And we shared some learning outcomes. Hopefully, these will be some of the takeaways from the session today, embedded in our exploration of different kinds of approaches to designing flexible learning and some of the benefits and constraints that go along with designing flexible learning opportunities. But first, before we get started, I wanted to say a special thank you to you all. And as Tom mentioned, during the past year and a half, you all as instructional designers have been at the forefront of the transition to virtual teaching and learning, whether it's in in your institution of higher learning, in your K-12 school, as an educator or designer, in your business and industry setting, throughout different kinds of learning contexts, instructional designers played a critical role in learning continuity and keeping things moving forward from a learner standpoint. So anyway, big shout out to you all. And I know that you all have experienced many of the issues that we're going to talk about today and have some great ideas too to share. So again, I want to leave time to hear from you, and not just your questions, but also your experiences. What is this thing called flexible learning? Flexible learning, the way that I've defined it before, refers to the ability to customize the learning experience and in ways that are related to its location, its pace, how we deliver it through what kinds of delivery modes, whether it's face-to-face or online, synchronous or asynchronous. And then the learning content itself can be made to be flexible. But I also wanted to start out by saying that flexible learning, even though it's a very hot topic at the moment, it's really not a new topic. Flexible learning has been with us for a very long time, dating back to the use of books for instruction, right? Some of our early forms of instructional media, print-based instruction, correspondence education, one of the earliest forms of flexible learning. So it's been with us for more recently in terms of e-learning and blended learning concepts that offer us different kinds of flexibility. But as we've just talked about, flexible learning has really taken off in the past year and a half, just due to the pressing need to make learning flexible. But I thought you might enjoy knowing that remote instruction is also not new, a specific form of flexible learning. This ad was from the journal AV Instruction in May of 1971. So it's easy to go remote, or it was then, if you had an entire television crew and the control equipment and cameras. You could take all this equipment and these personnel with you and teach from anywhere. So think about how far we've come, that you might sit in your living room like I'm doing right now. Maybe you are too, or in your remote location, and teach or learn, and think about how far we've come in being able to do that. So in what ways can learning be made flexible? There are a number of ways that we can think about this. And specifically today, I'm going to focus on 3 different ways: the where, or the location of learning, the when learning takes place, and what is the learning content, and how can it be made more flexible. So let's start with when. Synchronicity of learning is really one of the key strategies in making learning more flexible. So providing different times for learners to engage in learning experiences, such as in asynchronous learning, affords great flexibility. And sometimes synchronous opportunities might be essential from an instructional standpoint. And certainly synchronous forms of instruction are the closest approximation to what we might be used to in face-to-face instruction, right? And so we relied on synchronous forms of instructional delivery by Zoom, like we're using now, and other forms of video or web conferencing during the response to the pandemic, because it was the quickest way to shift to virtual teaching and learning, whether you're in a educational system or in a training environment. We've relied heavily on synchronous instruction. And however, asynchronous approaches provide even greater flexibility, because they allow learners to engage in learning opportunities possibly any time. I want to tell you a little bit about our online program at Virginia Tech. Has been delivered asynchronously for a number of years. Well, I'll stop and tell you a quick story here about, I guess, my greatest involvement in designing flexible learning was the design of this program. Back in 1998, when we started the program online, we designed it in a way that was very lockstep, right? Like, here's the curriculum, these 3 courses this semester, and then next semester, these 3 courses, at this time. And, if you missed one, if you couldn't sign up for all 3, or you couldn't finish one because, life happens, then you had to wait another couple of years before we offered it again, because we were going through the whole curriculum in a very lockstep way. Well, it didn't take us long to see that was problematic for our learners, who should be primary in our considerations, right? Our learners were and are teachers and now trainers as well, and learning and development professionals. So most of our learners are employed. And so we're trying to juggle working full time as well as being a parent and possibly a spouse, and maybe even having some personal interests. And we often call distance education or online education the part number 3, or the third job of a person, so of a student. So anyway, after the workday is done and the family time is over, that's typically when our learners wanted to engage, not necessarily at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when we were available. So we stepped back when we lost a sufficient number of students because they couldn't keep up. We realized that we really needed to change our approach. So we stepped back and revamped the whole program to be completely asynchronous, allowing students to take any course at any time. And that approach has allowed more students to persist and to flexibly engage and complete the program, much more so than in our very lockstep manner. So anyway, that's how we came to learn that our students' needs really, prevailed, as they always should, right? In that case, we needed to provide instruction asynchronously. So what are some considerations, though? What do we need to think about in terms of considering synchronous or asynchronous? And I've listed a few considerations there. Of course, if you're engaging in synchronous instruction, like today, some of you may be in different time zones. Last night, I had a session with a group that was in Japan, and it was Monday morning for them and Sunday night for me. But so that's these are the kind of considerations when you have international learners, and in business and industry, often, globally situated companies have these kinds of constraints. And so that's another benefit of asynchronous instruction. There are challenges with asynchronous instruction. So not that it's the perfect solution too. The challenges mainly lie in the human element, and that is when you're allowed to engage in a way that's completely, self-paced and at your discretion, there's a tendency to put it on the back burner, right? And so there can be issues of completion or non-completion and dropout. That's a significant problem with asynchronous courses. So there are things you can do to help, address these issues in terms of monitoring student progress and things like that. But those are some of the challenges. The where of learning also impacts its flexibility. So changes in our physical location, that's one of the key aspects of flexible learning, right? And primary in consideration of our response to the pandemic. So in most cases, the shift to virtual teaching and learning engaged in synchronous instruction time, but in different places, right? Because again, like I said a moment ago, it was the quickest way to shift, the closest approximation to face-to-face instruction, if that's what you engaged in. So synchronous models, again, easiest to transition. And then another another way that you can kick it up a notch in terms of gaining greater flexibility in location is to create mobile applications of learning. So I'm thinking particularly of our learners in the workplace who maybe need to be on the move. Maybe I'm thinking about our colleagues in healthcare, in the pharmaceutical industry, or in manufacturing who need to keep the workflow moving and engage in learning in the flow of work. I'm sure that's a phrase you may have heard recently. So making learning a part of the daily activity. So making learning available on mobile apps where you can, stop on your desktop, pick up your iPad or your phone and go to another location and do something. And then when you get a few minutes, continue on. Mobility provides you with that opportunity to keep learning. So some other affordances and constraints in terms of the physical aspect of learning include access, of course. Do you have the technology you need? Do you have the bandwidth you need? That was a huge issue, especially in K-12 situations over the past year and a half. Do we have access to the bandwidth we need? And particularly in rural locations where I am and maybe where you are, access to networks and access to technologies is not abundant. So that can pose some challenges. The presence of other learners is something to consider. Is that necessary? Do you need to engage in group work? Do we need to be in the same location to have these kinds of interactions that are related to the learning outcomes that you're striving for? The presence of support and support resources can be a real benefit if you're in the same location. And if not, how can we provide that support in a distributed manner? The environment impacts learning. And, as I'm sure you have experienced, like I was just experiencing a moment ago when my cat was trying to bomb our session here. When you're learning, in a location, then, there are factors in the environment, maybe like family members who are also trying to work or learn, and need quiet or need bandwidth, and, you're competing. So these are some of the considerations in terms of place. Learning content flexibility. So there are things we can do with the content to make it more flexible. And so how do we do that? Well, one way is to consider the size and the scope of the content. One of the strategies we used early in our instructional technology master's program was to take our 30 credit hours and break them up into 1 and 2 credit hour modules in order to make them more digestible and more feasible for our learners and enhance the flexibility of them, and also to strategically address the kinds of learning outcomes that were required by the state, our Department of Education, for teachers. So there were a couple reasons for doing it. But when you have the opportunity to break up the content into smaller units, it can make it seem more feasible to learners and help ensure that completion happens. So some examples of approaches to doing that are modular learning. Like early in e-learning development, we learned that breaking content down into modules was helpful. And more recently, there's been a great emphasis on micro-learning, breaking learning down into smaller chunks, just tied to a single learning outcome, and making it bite-sized, even more feasible, and more flexible in terms of how learners can engage. And curated learning opportunities like LinkedIn Learning, for example, where you have an entire suite of courses, and you can choose from those and engage in the content as you wish. Another approach is your choice of content. So this may not be, a factor in higher education or K-12 education context, but in training and learning and development contexts, often it's appropriate and possible to provide a menu of content, again, curated learning, but even down to the point of deciding learning activities, assessment activities, and designing personalized pathways through the content. And so we're going to get into some of these strategies here in a little bit. So what are some examples of flexible design approaches or models? And I'm going to turn it over to you and see if you want to give a shout out to share what are some design approaches or models, the names of models that you've used or heard about that are known for their flexibility. HyFlex, yes. The HyFlex model is probably the most referenced model here in the past year and a half. And I encourage you, if you haven't checked out Brian Beatty's book, Brian Beatty was the originator of the HyFlex model. It's freely available, and I have a link to it at the end of the presentation. So giving some excellent guidance there in terms of how to how you can create learning approaches that are flexible. It's, I've seen it interpreted to mean a very specific delivery strategy a lot in the past year, and that is, and we've done it here at Virginia Tech too. Well, I've seen it used to mean simultaneous or synchronous delivery, where you have some participants in a classroom setting and some online. And so that is an example of the HyFlex approach, but it's not the only way. I think Brian would talk about how it gives learners a choice even greater than that. I remember him talking about in a session last year how he would ask learners every week, how do you want to get together this week? And he could sort of plan, and then they could change their mind as well. But he would try to gauge their interest on a weekly basis and try to respond in that manner. Rapid prototyping, yes, that's another. Mixed mode, right. Competency-based. We have a lot of great approaches to flexible learning. And I'll throw out another couple. Flip learning is another common one. Blended learning. All of these are examples of different kinds of flexible learning and delivery. Okay. So how can we design for flexibility? Where are the decision points? And that's, as an instructional designer, I think that's probably the most interesting part of thinking about this, right? So we can think about the general concepts of how can we make learning flexible, but this is where the rubber meets the road, right? This is how can we think through the process of instructional design. I've presented ADDIE here, which is something that a process that many of us are familiar with, but I want to just focus in on two particular stages in this general design model, and that is in the analysis stage, thinking about who our learners are and what their learning context is, like we talked about earlier a little bit, and then some design decisions that can be made to create more flexible learning environments. So those are the two key aspects of ADDIE. Okay, so let's start with analysis, the first stage in the design process. So I want to emphasize first and foremost that context matters, and you've probably heard the phrase "content is king," and I guess I would counter with "context is king." Really, we can design an excellent lesson plan based on the targeted learning outcome. But if we don't consider the factors in the context of learning and also the context of teaching, if we're separated for this particular event, there's a strong chance that the learning will not be successful because of all the factors that can impact, like we mentioned earlier, in terms of the synchronous and asynchronous learning environments and also location-based learning. So what can we learn about our learners in their context so that we can design effective and flexible learning experiences? Well, we need to know their physical location to start with, right? And if they're located in certain places, like if they're all in Blacksburg here, then that will impact my design decisions. I could have students come to class as we're doing now, right, in this particular semester. But in the case of our online program, our students are everywhere. They're mostly in Virginia. There's some across the US, and there's some in other nations. Because of the distributed nature of the students, I can't require them to come, to be in a classroom. And then in training and development contexts, in many cases, our employees are distributed globally. And so gathering physically may not be an option. So we need to know about where learners are, what their access is to technology, to connectivity, and also their personal culture of learning. Can we offer more self-directed, incredibly flexible learning experiences to this particular group of learners and expect that they'll be successful? And we know that, for example, even just in higher education, the difference between undergraduate students and graduate students is enormous in terms of completion rates, and that using synchronous and asynchronous instructional strategies to engage with these different groups of learners has different kinds of outcomes, And so even as we saw here in Virginia Tech, I'm sure you all may have experienced this similar things, that in some instances, faculty would try to be, ultimately flexible and provide asynchronous learning experiences to undergraduate learners who never had experienced that kind of an approach. And many of whom struggle because of it, because they didn't have the self-regulation skills and the experience in knowing just how to move forward in this kind of, free environment. So the personal culture of learning can really impact the likelihood of success. Also, in terms of the teaching context, we need to think about what factors should impact our decision-making and planning. The number of learners. I know Chuck Hodges is here with us today, and this is a topic of great interest to Chuck and one that we've discussed a bit. The number of learners that you have in a learning experience can drastically impact your choices in terms of what you can do with instructional strategies, and therefore, the flexibility of how you engage with them. And also your comfort as an instructor or the instructor that you're working with, taking on new and different approaches, and the technologies that might be used to facilitate those approaches. That's a huge factor. It was, again, in the past year and a half when we had faculty and learning and development personnel being forced into virtual education for the first time, and having to be very quick learners in terms of getting up to speed and being able to continue instructional activities. And then there's organizational culture related to instructional delivery. And what I mean by that is how does the organization value or not certain kinds of instructional delivery? And this is another big area of interest of mine. I think it's interesting that there's so much talk about concern over the quality of online education, and that's been around since the start of distance education, really being perceived as a less than experience because we're not in the room where it happens. So you're separated from the knowing one, right? The educator or the learning professional. So, but in training or workplace context, this season isn't even a thing, right? It's you don't hear these kinds of conversations in business and industry, like, oh, do you think this, we can do training online because that it may not be as effective because Barbara's not in the room with them. It's been proven that learning can effectively happen through media for a very long time, right? We know that, but this isn't even a conversation. The issue of quality, business and industry leverages technology and flexible learning approaches because they have to, and they rely on it, and they know it works, right? So I'll get off that soapbox. But anyway, it's a factor, right? And then access, again, access from a instructor standpoint. My bandwidth here at home is terrible. But anyway, it's enough to get the job done. But bandwidth and access to the proper tools can impact the instructor's abilities as well as the students. So let's talk about design for a moment. Shifting away from analysis and trying to figure out who the learners are, where they are, and what they have access to, and what environmental factors might impact decisions. Let's think about design decisions. And first, I want to emphasize that in flexible learning situations, it's really even more important to make learning outcomes explicit, to let learners know, and no matter what context, this is what you're expected to learn. And if there's a time constraint, this is when by, and if there's not a time constraint, that's fine. But it's really critical to communicate with learners because, like we learned in our online program when we went asynchronous, it's sort of like letting go. You think, oh, is this going to work? and then the learner, can feel isolated and might wonder what's going on. But frequent communication, and check-ins, are strategies that can be used to make the learners feel connected, but also it's really critical to help them understand what's expected in terms of learning outcomes. And I put a link to Bloom's taxonomy, just if you want to have it as a reference point to work with subject matter experts. It kind of helps think through the process of identifying outcomes. And then it's essential to choose your instructional methods or strategies, and then the supporting media to facilitate the learning outcomes in flexible ways. And I've embedded links here. I won't go to these documents right here, but I'll share this presentation with Tom. And Tom, you can feel free to share it with everyone later. It's huge, so I want to compress it. It has a lot of images in it. But anyway, these documents can provide some very helpful resources in terms of instructional strategies and flexible delivery modes, right? And technologies that support these different kinds of instructional strategies. The first one is from the U.S. Distance Learning Association. It's about 10 years old, but it's still very relevant. And it breaks down learning in terms of time and place too, like we've just done, and helps you think through different kinds of instructional strategies that you might use depending on the time and place you want to engage in. And then supporting media, this is a link to Tori Trust's book on using technology in support of learning. That's freely available. I have a link to it at the end as well. So thinking again about time and instructional design decisions, thinking and not just logistics, right? Initially, we were thinking about the logistics and the context, but now we're thinking about instructional decision making. So let's think about, when are synchronous interactions essential? And are they even essential? Maybe they are. And think about the social aspect of your learning event or learning program. Is there, is it essential to be a part of that particular class or session, or can you provide that outside, right? And so when you have synchronous learning opportunities, it diminishes flexibility. But again, from an instructional standpoint, it might be critical for, if you're trying to develop some sort of interpersonal skill or some attitudinal kind of outcome. Or if you're trying to, demonstrate a concept where you really need to be in the same space to see it. There are many good reasons why, face-to-face instruction and real-time instruction, synchronous instruction, is probably the most beneficial approach. But these are just guiding questions to help you think about that. So some examples of such interactions might be discussions or group activities or demonstrations, specialized resources that require you to be somewhere at a given time, like in a lab. And then there's also the opportunity to broadcast and, record sessions and broadcast them and make them available later for learners who can't be there, which is another recommendation of Brian Beatty in the HighFlex approach. Now, some questions with regard to place. How can learner participation be designed and managed across settings? And this is a question that a lot of trainers and learning development professionals ask when thinking about designing workplace learning. How can we engage everyone globally or across, even more locally, but distributed, across time zones? How can we make sure that we engage everyone? Using strategic groupings of learners is one way to do this for instructional activities. Maybe you have collaborative projects or peer reviews. We use peer reviews in our portfolio assignments in our online program. So we have very limited student projects because that, again, when you have group projects and synchronous activities, that cuts back on the flexibility. But again, the goal should be to strike a balance. When is it essential from an instructional standpoint, and can it be facilitated given the context that you're in? So providing options is in terms of activities and content, like we mentioned a few minutes ago, is one way to increase flexibility. So this was something, this learning board is one example of a strategy that I'm a big fan of. Tori Truss, one of our co-authors with Chuck Hodges on here as well, on a piece that we did earlier in the pandemic about the difference between emergency remote instruction and online learning. But Tori has a great example here that you can link to called Preparing for Remote and Online Teaching. And I'll show you this board. And this is openly available, and you may use it as long as you give Tori credit and her co-author, but you can look at how they've provided these different options for learners to choose from. And in this case, the learners are faculty in their College of Education at UMass Amherst. So you may find these resources to be of great interest in terms of designing online learning and flexible learning options. It's a terrific set of resources embedded here. So you can just link to that when you get the PowerPoint. This matrix is something that Aaron Bond and I, another collaborator, frequent collaborator here at Virginia Tech, developed in an attempt to help facilitate alignment in the design process. So when you're thinking about what your learning outcomes need to be, here's a place to jot those down. And then you can think about, okay, if we're going to have a face-to-face activity, how can we engage the learners in that kind of a space, or synchronously or asynchronously? So it's just really a brainstorming tool or a mapping tool for you to use and jot your ideas down in terms of trying to align them with the learning outcomes. And that really goes to one of the great questions one of you asked before this session was, how can you ensure rigor, and how can you communicate with your supervisors or upper level administrators that this is a credible approach, that flexible learning is indeed credible approach to learning. Again, this is it's an issue that's been debated for eons, but the rigor is in the design process. That you're using evidence-based, data-driven design processes to guide your decision making, right? And just because something is flexible doesn't mean it's less rigorous or challenging. Those two things do not equate. So you can use this as a mapping mechanism, much like accrediting bodies do. They want to see what the student learning outcomes are, what the activities have been to facilitate those, and then the assessment activities. So you can use these kinds of matrices to show this kind of alignment and show how the learning outcomes are being addressed. And then maybe later provide exemplars from the learner deliverables. So assessment design, another huge topic. And I want to give a shout out to Chuck again here, who's here with us today, and Michael Barber, his co-author, for this excellent piece that I've linked here on this screen down at the bottom. So they did a great job in this article detailing different kinds of assessment approaches and describe them in the context of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I hope you'll take an opportunity to check it out. It's a terrific resource. So here's another matrices you can use in terms of aligning your assessment strategies and where and when they might happen in terms of their flexibility, and align them with your learning outcomes. Before I go there, I want to say too, I talked earlier in terms of learning content and flexibility. In assessment flexibility, you can give learners options. Now, again, context is king, right? In some situations, like in workplace learning, particularly with regard to compliance training, maybe options aren't possible, right? If the employee needs to finish the compliance training, and it has to be done a certain way, then maybe, this is not an option. But if you're in a higher education setting or K-12 setting, or even in a workplace setting where options might be possible, you can provide the learner with some choices. One of the things I did in the course I taught this summer on flexible learning design, I had the students propose their own final project, and it needed to have some, indication of learning of the different learning outcomes from the course, but I left that totally open, right? And then I also, they had to design a proposal and get my feedback on it and make sure, get it approved. And then their deliverable had to align with their proposal, but it gave great control and a sense of ownership to the learners in terms of deciding how am I going to demonstrate that I learn, as opposed to taking a test, which, in that situation, having the opportunity to apply learning in a realistic, authentic manner was much more meaningful. And so if these kinds of approaches are possible, and again, going back to the article I just mentioned that Chuck and Michael Barber wrote, has some great ideas in there for flexibility and assessment. So one thing in terms of flexibility, and I see we're close to time here, I'm going to leave some time for questions, but when we provide enhanced levels of flexibility, it really then becomes crucial that the organization of the learning event and the expectations are made clear in advance, right? So we can help support learner engagement and completion by letting them know, what's being expected, what the outcomes are going to be, and what the strategies are going to be, what they're going to be expected to do, and by when, if there is a deadline. That needs to be communicated and reiterated, just to ensure the learner that they're on the same page with you. Again, no matter what the context, that clarity of expectations is really critical. All right, so that was my final tip in terms of designing flexible learning, and I have a plethora of resources here for you. A couple of sets of different readings, and you should be able to access all. There are a couple of them that aren't freely available, and I just want to say this book by Patty Shank, the Online Learning Idea Book, is a whole book of ideas from online educators that Patty collected using an incredible array of different instructional strategies. So this is volume 2, 2011. I bought it, I think, for like $10 online used, but it's a terrific resource. So I can't recommend it highly enough. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and see what questions you have or feedback with regard to your experiences in flexible learning.